Welcome to the second and final day of the Fourth World Conference of Screenwriters. I hope you enjoyed all of yesterday and last night's activities. Welcome back. Especially if you're from the United States looking, yes, you might think that this is the former and current presidents of the Writers Guild panel, but it is not. If it were, Howard Rodman would be up here too. Is Howard here? Anyway, no, okay. No, this is the Subversive Scripts panel. I was thinking maybe that we should call it Insidious Inc. But while that might be a good name for a band, I think Subversive Scripts may be more descriptive as to what we're going to be talking about. I was reminding our panelists a few days ago that one of the movie mogul Sam Goldwyn's sayings was that if you want to send a message, use Western Union, the telegram service, not the movies. Clearly that's not the case today, if it ever was. Certainly artists have been sending hidden messages through their art since early men and women were painting on the walls of caves. If nothing else, the painted symbols said, "Keep out," a message we seem to have returned to in the last couple of years. You can read more about all our panelists in your programs, but I'd like to briefly introduce them to you. To my immediate left, Alex Haridi is from Sweden, a screenwriter and novelist who is head writer and co-producer of the 2014 political thriller Blue Eyes series. Karianne Lund is, to his left, is from Norway and was the head writer and co-creator of the political drama series Occupied. David Goodman has written for Star Trek Enterprise and any number of sitcoms, great American sitcoms. He's best known at the moment for his work with Seth MacFarlane on the series Family Guy and the series The Orville. And Chris Kaiser, and I should say David is the current president of the Writers Guild of America West. And Chris Kaiser is a former political speechwriter who has worked in independent film and television drama and has a number of current projects, one of which is a reboot, a new version of Party 5, a series he created 20 years ago, but a whole new take on that series, which he'll talk about among other things. So I really wanted to start with our writers from Norway and Sweden, especially because the series that they're here to talk about are overtly political, have overt political messages in their storytelling. So I wanted to begin with them. So Alex, if you wanted to start and just tell us a little bit about Blue Eyes and what your intentions were.
Okay, so Blue Eyes was a political thriller. It was 10 episodes of 1 hour each. And it sort of chronicles the run-up to a national election in Sweden. And there is a far-right party that is on the rise. And in the first episode, a local politician from the far-right party is murdered. And so the show follows partly the story of who killed this woman, but then also partly the political how everyone's positioning themselves and trying to take advantage of this horrible crime. Mm-hmm. And so the idea for the show started back in 2010 when Sweden got a right-wing party into parliament for the first time. And we, most of us were shocked and appalled by this. And so a few of us writers and producers wanted to do a show about this. And so we kind of had the overt intention of trying to change the world with our show. But we also had a theory of the case that you can't actually change someone's opinion with a show. I don't know about you guys, I don't think I've ever seen 1 hour of television that's sort of made me go like, oh, I've been thinking completely wrong and I'm going to change my vote in the election. So the theory that we had was that what you do, how you change people's minds are in conversation with the people around you. Mm-hmm. So we wanted the show to be a conversation starter. We wanted to be a little bit provocative so that after you see the show is on Sunday nights at 9, so you'd get to work on Monday, and then like you'd talk about the show at work, and you'd be like, "Oh my God, I'm working with a racist." No, but no, but we wanted it to be not easily digestible.
Well, I mean, in terms of a conversation starter, I think it certainly did that. And you had terrific ratings, you had terrific reviews, but I gather that you also had the highest number of complaints ever recorded to the Swedish Broadcasting Commission.
Yes, we did, and once again, that was partly it was intentional. Partly we wanted to sort of skate the line of it was on a public broadcaster, so they have rules and regulations about what they're sort of how they're supposed to operate, because they're by and from and for the entire Swedish people. Right. So there's this board that you can file a complaint to if you feel that they haven't lived up to the rules. But then again, like anyone can file a complaint. Like filing a complaint doesn't mean that something wrong has actually been done. So we did have the record, and we still have the record for a drama series with most complaints filed. And
did they come from across the spectrum? Or
yes, they did, which was also intentional. There were complaints from the far right, and there were complaints from the far left, and there were complaints from libertarians who just don't like public service and complain about everything. There were complaints really from everywhere. But I think fairly early on in the process, I decided that if I was going to do the show, I was going to do the show all the way. So,
I gather. I mentioned to you earlier that I was speaking to someone here from Sweden yesterday who was saying that, given the prescience of what you did in 2014 and what's going on in Swedish politics right now, that it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for Blue Eyes to make it to the air today.
Most likely. I don't think it would be made today. I was a little bit surprised that it was made even back then. But no, today it wouldn't be made at all. But it ended up being one of those situations where there was a change in management, and the old crew sort of greenlit stuff on their way out the door. So we actually had to work with completely new management that had come in when we were shooting the show. We had to work with management that weren't invested in the show and hadn't done it, and kind of didn't want to do it.
Right.
But we were really lucky that the head of the network loved the show. So it was like everyone else hated it at the network, but just the head of the network loved the show. So, but then also because it was flagged as a controversial show, so we were put through loops that another show probably wouldn't be put through. So for instance, we had to work directly with the network lawyers. They had to read the scripts, and we had to talk to them, and this would be, normally in Sweden, this would be a process that doesn't reach the actual production. No one knows what sort of happens at the network, but we had to work directly with them, which was actually wonderful. I love the lawyers. Because the thing is, they actually know their shit. Like, they know what they're talking about. And the problem is when you're talking to middlemen, when you're talking to like middle management that are trying to guess what the lawyers are going to say, and they don't actually know anything. So you're sitting, and also it was kind of fun because the lawyers, I think they were bored with their jobs. That they would be like rubber stamping stuff that for like years and years had been just like rubber stamping stuff that no one ever is going to object to. And I was like, ooh, this is tricky. Can we do this? So they were actually awesome.
Karianne, could you tell us about Occupied?
Yes, Occupied is a show about Russia invading Norway in a near future. It's about Norway turning down the oil production, and Russia want to get it up again, and they're invading on behalf of the European Union, actually. To do that, we had to make this big energy crisis in the world, and we had to say that the Middle East was in war, and we had to say that it was no more oil production anywhere. So it was a long stretch, but our intention was not to talk about Russia invading Norway, but what happens to a country when it gets invaded? What would Norwegian do today? If we could keep our economic benefits, will we rebel against an invasion, or will we just keep on going?
And what was the national reaction to the show when it aired?
It was people were a bit concerned about the relationship between Norway and Russia, and we did get some critics before the show aired, actually. But and when we almost finished writing it, Russia invaded Ukraine. And the people who was worried about us demonizing Russia they couldn't, it was difficult to argue about that. And we didn't make a show about Russia being the demon. We made the show about the Norwegian and the good and bad was within the Norwegians themselves. So I think, it's kind of got silence after the show was aired.
Yeah. Was there ultimately? I've unfortunately so far only seen the first 2 episodes, and I'm looking forward to seeing the others. But was there sort of a conscious message you wanted to get across in this notion of how would Norway respond, or?
Originally, this is an idea from a famous writer in Norway called Jo Nesbø, and his father was actually in the wrong side of the war, and he kind of wanted to tell a different hero story, not a hero story, but a different story about how we look upon ourselves as this people who was fighting the Nazis during the war, but actually we didn't do it before. We sat on the fence till we knew who's going to win this war, much more than the picture we have of ourselves. And that was one aspect that I know Jo Nesbø was eager to come across with. The other thing is we wanted to kind of problemize what's a terrorist and what's a freedom fighter, and that depends on the eyes and who's pointing. Are you a terrorist or you're fighting for your freedom?
Right. No, I was just agreeing. You and I were talking before. Was it a contentious point of plot to have this cooperation between Russia and the European Union? Was that controversial at all, or?
Yeah, it was. We used a lot of time to kind of make the setup believable, because we wanted it to be. Could be true. So we talked to a lot of experts to figure out how could this actually happen. And the funny thing is, if you talk to the experts, they weren't so skeptical about this idea, but people were more skeptical if you do. But more they know about the situation and about what will happen if we have an energy crisis, the more they were actually not thinking this was such a long stretch. And they, but we needed Norway to be all alone, so left alone from Europe, from the United States, and so we had to make the setup so we could have the story we want to tell.
Chris, over the course of the many different series and films that you have worked on, have you been conscious of wanting to include messages or putting messages into your work that you hope will have an impact on the audience?
I think increasingly recently, that's been true. Early on, maybe for anyone, the stuff that happens just happens to you. You know, you put out a lot of work and you see what somebody's interested in, and then a show gets on the air and suddenly that's the thing you're doing. And so the first show I ever did was Party of Five. with my writing partner, Amy Lippman, and that was not consciously about any particular message. In the long run, its impact had mostly to do with its effect on families and the way people talk to each other. And so good shows have positive impacts in the world, even if they don't have overt political messages. But more recently, and I don't know whether it's because I'm older and the world has gotten more complicated, I have been more interested in doing that. So probably the last 3 or 4 things I've done have all had some underlying political message, and we can talk about them at some point or not. There was a show I did called Tyrant, which was about political families in the Middle East, and it was one of the first shows, probably the only show in the United States that ever had Arab Muslim leads in it, and it had some complicated arguments about it. It also had a complicated response, and probably rightly so. I'm doing a show on Netflix now, which is really almost a direct response to what's going on in the United States, a story which is essentially about a town being punished for its crimes, but really about the crimes of the last number of centuries of the United States on the continent, and the question of whether, if you started all over again, we'd make the same mistakes again. So we can talk about that at some point. You had mentioned Party of Five, and we're doing a new version of Party of Five. The original version of Party of Five was about 5 kids whose parents died in a car crash, and they raised each other, mostly because they had one brother who was old enough to do that, who didn't want to raise them, but agreed to do it. So it's a family that's tenuously connected to each other in the long run, manages to stay together over a number of years. There's been a big push in the United States to remake old shows, and we had a lot of conversations about whether anyone wanted to remake Party of Five again. Some of those shows, by the way, get remade because they just take the characters where they are and take them 20 years on. And it was very clear to us that didn't mean anything. The show was about 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 15-year-olds whose parents had died, and we didn't think there was much of a story about 40-year-olds whose parents had died. That wasn't really the basis of a drama. And then there was some conversation about whether we should simply just change the ethnicity of the family and say, and very specifically the conversation was, should we just do a Latino version of Party of Five, which probably had its own value at that point, because one of the things that you end up doing in television is just allowing people to live with people who are different in ways that are not specifically about them being different, but in many ways about them being the same. So you put a show on about an ordinary Latino family that doesn't normally exist in American television, and that would provide some value, because we get to know them in the way that Will and Grace let us know about people gay people, and that opened up doors in the United States to understanding something like that. But we weren't particularly interested in that, just in part because we'd done the show already. And then about 1.5 years ago, the world started to change, and we had this like mini revelation that there was a way to do the show which was meaningful on multiple levels. And so this new version of Party of Five is about a Latino family, we hope living in Los Angeles, but it depends upon tax breaks. They may live someplace else that provides greater incentives to our production company. A Latino family whose parents are deported, and whose children therefore have to raise themselves. And there, I think we found finally a way of doing the story that was not a repeat of the thing we had done before, that spoke directly to questions about what was going on in the United States, that allowed us initially to do a very political story, because the pilot episode is about the deportation, and eventually just to talk about family and what family means. And if we're lucky, to let people take a look at that and say, well, maybe the policy of the United States to separate families is not such a good idea. I have no idea whether anyone's going to watch that and change his or her mind, but maybe.
Does your background, I mean, you worked in politics. I mean, I think from time to time you still do. Does that impact, does it have any effect on your writing? Do you?
I'll only say that I was drawn to both of those things probably because something inside of me that I want to talk about.
Right.
But I don't tend to think about my writing as overtly political. Mostly we're talking about trying to come up with stories through which political messages can be, and that's the name of the panel, subversively conveyed to an audience. So this Netflix show, which is about trying again to set up a social structure, and we make all the same mistakes, has very few overtly political conversations about it. It has few. Mostly you're just watching a drama and involved, I hope, you're watching it, and you get involved in that, and subliminally the messages come across that there are good and there are mistakes that we can make that we need to avoid making in the future that we've made in the past. Right. Fundamentally, how far is it possible for the apple to fall from the tree so that subsequent generations aren't making the same kinds of mistakes that the previous generations made?
David, working on Family Guy is a case in point of being able to use the comedy, the sort of off-the-wall comedy, the sort of however you want to describe it, but to actually talk about things that people would just as soon not be talked about.
Right.
And
Well, even the very nature of the format of Family Guy is subversive in the sense that it's a cartoon, which has a people have think it's for a lot of kids think it's for them, and even adults can think just by the nature of that format of being a cartoon that's for them, and so you end up talking about a lot of adult themes to kids who are watching this show, which gets us into some trouble sometimes. All the way through, Seth, who created the show, is a very political person. He's very anti-religion. He's pro-science, pro-education. Which, ironically, that is subversive in the United States. To me, is really sad. I think of like some of the ways in which we do things for the sake. It looks like we're doing a joke, but in fact, we're doing something based on the rules that we're given. So, for instance, you're not allowed to say as an exclamation, Jesus Christ, on television, in broadcast television in the United States, unless he's there. So Jesus Christ is a character on Family Guy. And so we'll say, there's an early joke. With first time we did that, there's a fire in the bar, and somebody says, Jesus Christ, and then you widen to reveal Jesus there. Said, what? We got to get out of here. And that's an example of that's subverting the rule that's being placed on us. Years ago on television, the subject of abortion in the 70s was a subject that you could, dramatize. There were comedies. There was a sitcom called Maude, very famously did an episode where she got an abortion. And now you're not really allowed to do that on television. And Seth felt very strongly that he wanted to do an episode where Lois and Peter are struggling with a pregnancy, an unwanted pregnancy, and that Lois is considering having an abortion. And it was interesting because the studio, I said, they're not going to let us air this. They're not going to let us do this. But I went to the head of the studio, and they were like, no, do this. This is great. This is great, because they liked the story that we came up with, and we produced it. And then the Southern, I don't know if you guys are familiar, the South is a thing in the United States. The Southern stations threatened not to air it. So it didn't air, but we did release it on DVD. And, it's interesting, to me, the United States has trumpets its dedication to freedom and freedom of speech, but there are enormously powerful forces that prevent it in certain areas. The story I was telling, we also sometimes we're subversive in that we do episodes that don't sound funny, and I always don't like describing these episodes because they just sound offensive. But we take them on in an effort, can we make this funny? And so we did an episode, for instance, where Peter has a stroke. It was based on this drawing that Seth had done of Peter with a stroke that he thought was funny, and then we did this episode. And I don't want to describe the episode because in describing it, it just doesn't sound funny. But maybe you watch it and you decide. But after it aired, I got a letter from the head of neurology at a New York hospital telling me the story of this 12-year-old girl who had watched the episode with her dad and correctly diagnosed the stroke he was having and saved his life. I didn't ask whether the doctor thought the episode caused the stroke, but But you
Or
think
whether he thought it was funny.
or whether he thought it was funny. But you think about that too. That we save someone's life. That seems amazing. So but we're that was very subversive to do an episode like that. And we've done lots of episodes like that, and lots of individual jokes that I personally find offensive that are on the show that play with that boundary of what's funny, but also making political comments.
And also on the Orville, I mean, you talk about the distancing factor of animation, which allows you to go into areas. And on the Orville, you've gone into outer space, and I was thinking about Gene Roddenberry always saying that the distance of time and space and the sort of alien quality of it, that you could tell social justice stories that you couldn't tell otherwise. But
that was certainly Seth's inspiration. He was, as am I, a huge Star Trek fan, and the idea was to update it, use the format of a science fiction show to tell some of those stories again. Maybe stories that you would not be able to tell in current day, but through the lens of aliens and outer space, you fool the censors. That was Gene Roddenberry's thing, is I'm fooling the censors, and we're still having to do that. We did an episode in our first season. We have this race of aliens that is all men. It's an all-male race, and there's a couple of these. They're a male couple on the ship, and they have a child. They lay an egg, and they have a child, and the child's a girl, and that they're in their society, girls have their sex changed to men. So the very controversial discussion on the ship is that this couple wants the doctor to change the baby's sex. And it was a really interesting way to explore some of these gender issues that are in a way that you would never be able to do if it was, if you were talking about human beings. It was probably our most controversial episode in that first year, but I mean, it sort of spoke to one of Seth's goals, one of our goals in doing the show, and we've, again, taking on, again, the things that are Seth's issues of, he's very anti-religion, he's very pro-science. Again, the fact that I say that and that's controversial in the United States to me is sad, but it's very much our goals in doing this show.
Are you feeling? Let me say that again. As other people have said, that none of the people on this panel are responsible for the current American presidential administration. But are you feeling any pushback at all in the other direction? Are you getting any, like, we can't say that because of the way things are, or is anybody coming after anyone?
Not yet. I mean, I think, I think that Trump, or he who shall not be named, is a entertainer. So there's a way in which he ends up being fair game in television. He's been on television as an entertainer for so long that certainly Family Guy is doing an episode. Currently, I'm not involved in it, but they're doing an episode involving him. And there's ways in which he's such a and dealing with public figures, you have a lot of leeway in the United States in terms of what you can and can't say about it. And then, to some extent, the issues that we face that we always get pushback are more sexual issues, as opposed those are where the standards are. Our standards and practices department is always worried about portrayal of sex, drug use, but politics seems, at least currently up to now, has been fair game. I don't know if you have it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that may be changing, I'll see, I don't know yet, is my new show's on Netflix, for example. And Netflix, I think, will have a much different perspective on this than, for example, the traditional broadcast network did. I had a similar issue. We did an episode in the 90s in Party of Five, where we, by the way, were able to do sophisticated, relatively controversial things by putting them in the mouths of very attractive young people. In other words, that was the way you could get around it, because people thought, oh, I'm watching a version of a teen show, and then suddenly they're talking about very complicated things, and one of the characters got pregnant, and we decided that we wanted to have an abortion, and the president of the network said, yes, you should do that, and we shot the episode, and right before it aired, he came back, actually in a meeting in which he was in tears, and said, our affiliates will not air this. And we also had to rewrite the episode and give her one of the rare instances of a 17-year-old miscarriage, which was terrible. I mean, we ended up folding because there was nothing else we could do. But that was driven by social and cultural issues in the United States, almost certainly in outside big cities, maybe in the South or in the Midwest, those affiliates who would not air a show like that. And so advertisers and networks were beholden to them, and things got changed because of it. Norman Lear didn't have as much of an issue then because he had greater control of his product back in that age, but we don't. Netflix is a different relationship with its viewership. It's an international viewership, and there are no affiliates in that way. We will see whether that protects us. So far, they are almost entirely open to us saying and doing anything we want to do, but we'll see.
Alex and Karianne, are you working on, are there current projects that you're working on or envisioning that are also as political as Blue Eyes and Occupied, or I mean, do you feel as though this is something more that you want to do, or are you feeling that, has there been pushback that's been discouraging or encouraging, or what have you thought?
I'm not working on a political series at the moment, but it's not because I don't want to do it. It's just not that now. But and I think, in a sense, you always think about some kind of message, either you write for a political series or not. You do want to lift your story on another level and say something about society, or something about relationship, or something about family structure, or so it will always be in my mind to have something to say. And I think that's for all writers, not just entertain, but something more. But it's I was thinking about that I think we don't have, in our country, we don't have, we can tell what almost everything we want to say. It's not, we don't feel, I don't think we had stopped an abortion episodes. And I was thinking about that and we're not doing what we can to tell the important stories in the countries we can't do it. And I was thinking we have an obligation to the countries that are not going to tell. It's not able, the writer's not able to tell what they want, to just be a little bit bolder. And that's some places they can't tell what they want, and we have to tell it for them. I think it's important.
God, I feel terrible saying what I'm going to say right after that. No, I think, to be quite honest, I think I'm a little bit politically depressed at the moment. Blue Eyes came out in 2014, and the world has changed a lot since. And in a way, it's sort of changed into what we wrote, which is really depressing, because it was supposed to be sort of a warning example and not a blueprint for the world to follow. But I think, so I'm not working on anything overtly political at the moment, but I've sort of shifted more, in my own writing, I've shifted more into sort of writing for a children's and young adult audience, because I think that's where the change starts. And I think those are the only people that you can actually change their minds with a story.
I used to work at the Children's Television Workshop, and the key window was 8 to 12. But they figured that was the time when you really could have an effect on young minds. And and teach them things. And we do had a ban on Jesus Christ, by the way, and Einstein. But yeah, for some reason, I was the first person who was ever allowed to put Einstein in a sketch because of the science, because they didn't want to make fun of science. So, you know. But I want to open it up to everyone here, to your questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand and wait for the microphone to arrive so everyone can hear you.
Hi, I'm wondering if the people on the panel could share with us what shows that they think are most subversive that they watch. My personal favorite in America is The President's Show, which I think depicts Trump in a way far more devastating than Alec Baldwin does. But I'm curious to hear what shows you think are the most subversive in your countries, or actually anywhere, whatever you watch.
Okay. I'm actually not quite sure what subversive means, but I have a pretty good idea. But I think for me, the interesting political shows right now is maybe *Handmaid's Tale*. I think it's quite interesting and very, very good. And *The Wire* is a big political favorite of mine.
You know, it's not political. I think it's a show you recommended to me. It's not political overtly, but the show Fleabag, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but I find it so subversive in its exploration of this woman's character and her sexual roles, and that to me is something that when I think of being subversive, that's what I picture. And if you haven't seen it, it's a great show. It's called Fleabag. It's actually a British show.
Phoebe Waller-Bridge. BBC. BBC.
I think, and also it's on the Amazon streaming service.
You know, this is probably not a perfect answer to that question, but I had thought for a long time that one of the things that was wrong with American television, at least, was that it spoke almost not at all to what it was like to live in America in the age in which we were living. In other words, there were plenty of things that there were all kinds of genre shows and well-done genre shows, and even things that were heightened that might be political dramas, but very little that was about the average American lives. So in weird ways, I think, and you can take this the wrong way, like the old Roseanne was subversive in an interesting way, or Shameless, or anything that says this is what it means to live in a country when you don't have enough money and you're not sure what tomorrow is going to be. I mean, that's how Americans, you know, a large percentage of people in our country actually live day to day. And I may not believe in all the political statements that some of those shows make, but to me, one of the boldest things you can do is actually just tell the truth about what life is like, as opposed to simply trying to entertain and distract. So it's a version of an answer. But I love Fleabag. This woman also wrote Killing Eve, so that's her latest thing. She's amazing.
Other questions? Oh, right.
Earlier, people spoke of, and I often hear people speak about political work trying to change people's minds. I wonder if you think that there's any value, and usually the notion of preaching to the choir is disparaged. I wonder if you think there's any value to presenting work that doesn't change people's minds, but advances their thinking and clarifies their thinking about things that, and builds community about things that they already believe.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's also kind of goes back to the one of the questions that was earlier about if Blue Eyes could be done today, because it's a few years old, the show. I think the media landscape is so different now, and it's also, I think, partly why I had problems answering the question about what shows I find subversive right now, because it feels like nowadays people don't watch the same show. And sometimes I laugh a lot at some of those sort of political satire shows that are done, and I love those. But I also feel sort of like that, in a way, going back to my political depression, in a way I sometimes feel like, what is the point? Because everyone is just watching the thing that reinforces their opinion. But having said that, I do agree with the gentleman in the back that part of the reason why a show like Blue Eyes shouldn't be done now is because now is not the time to change people's minds. Now is the time to sort of mobilize the good forces. And maybe the good forces need something wonderful to laugh at and feel good about themselves. But just as long as they don't get complacent.
There's a show on HBO last week with John Oliver. I don't know how global it is, but what to me, speaking to what you're bringing up, I never disagree with it. Is speaking to me. Its point of view is my point of view, but the way they tackle an issue, I think, really speaks to a criticism of how every other news organization in the United States, at least, tackles issues, which is not very well. And there's a way in which what I like about that show, and what I think what people, and I think it speaks to a young audience, which is good. It sort of says, look deeper. There's all sorts of look deeper and look more far-ranging. There are so many problems that we're not even talking about that are actually quite serious, quite dangerous, that aren't the same broad strokes things that we're just talking about in the United States, which is, Trump and how he governs and how the Republicans govern. There's so much more that we need to be looking at. And that, to me, speaks to that, which is this is a show that I completely agree with, but is also sort of making me look at the news with a more critical eye, which is, what aren't we talking about? What's really going on?
I think and I think what's happened also in the States, that one of the godsends in terms of pushing back and resisting the current administration has been the late night comedy shows. Trevor Noah, late night John Oliver, Seth Meyers, I'm missing people, but Samantha Bee. They have really put their necks out on all this and have been very outspoken and overt.
I think a lot of the recent political work on what's going on in our country suggests that the division has less to do with how people feel about particular issues and more about their sense of identity, that people vote who they are and not arguments that candidates make. So you identify yourself as a white man, white middle-class man, the wife of a white middle-class man, just somebody who's not a person of color, whatever it is. And you vote according to that. And the arguments that individual candidates make have less to do with it, so that many people who voted for Trump, for example, did not have a particular affinity to some of his arguments, but they were able to identify themselves as a potentially aggrieved group who would be helped by him. I think that relates to television in this way, which is questions of identity and who is acceptable and who isn't are most moved not, I think, by programming that is overtly political or subversive, but programming that normalizes other people. I think I've mentioned this before. There was a very famous example in the United States about a writer who made many decades ago a show called Julia, which was about an African-American woman who was, for the first time ever in the history of television, not a domestic servant. And the show in no other way spoke about the fact that she was black. It was not relevant to the story. And he was criticized for that, and he said, that's not the point. The point is, you just watch this person, and this person becomes a fully human being, and slowly your attitudes toward her change. I think that happens a lot in television. It happens slowly. Will and Grace, which I had mentioned before, I think is a good example of that. It had a meaningful impact on the way in which Americans began to view people whose sexual choices were different from their own. And so television, I think the most powerful thing it can do in some ways is almost not make any argument at all, but just force you to live with people who are different from you for a long enough period of time until you decide, well, they're not so different from the way I am. Now, I don't know how long a period of time that takes takes to begin to loosen identity and undermine identity politics. But in a world in which people are almost entirely immune to argument anymore, because they believe everything that anyone says who does not agree with them is a kind of spin, and they listen almost entirely to people they do believe, which is, I think, one of the things that Jeremy's talking about. It's hard to move people that way, and easier to begin to say to people, we are actually more alike than different. It's a little Pollyannish, and it's a long process, but I think it's probably the most effective way that television can change the politics of a given culture.
Coming to you with the mic.
You mentioned Roseanne before, that the first show, the original show, was a conversation starter. The second, the reboot, was a conversation starter until she stopped the conversation. What did you think while she was still on the air as really being successful? How would you approach, and especially America, good people on both sides, to quote? And now that she's off the air, do you think the conversation will stop again, that maybe the reboot has started?
I'm not an expert at this. And I have to admit that I did not watch much of that. I tuned into that new show. Look, I think it's not a bad idea to have all kinds of conversations on television. I'm not nervous about people talking about amongst themselves and in front of us about how they feel. One of the reasons why, I don't know about you, I try to listen to the other side, even in political conversations. Like I tune in, or I subscribe to people who are writing on the other side of the political spectrum. So I was appreciative of the fact that show was an attempt to do that. What Roseanne did was entirely different, and how she was punished, or whether that was the appropriate punishment, I think is a separate question. That show's coming back now, and I assume it will attempt to do more or less what it did before, which was to express more or less accurately a point of view about a group of people who don't tend to see themselves on television, but who actually do exist in the United States, and whom we need in this country to pay some attention to. I'll just say a very quick story that has nothing to do with this, but I was talking to a person who was running for Congress from Michigan, who said to me, I want you to know, and I'm a liberal Democrat, and I'm supporting, and she is too, and she said, I want you to know that the people in my district who voted for Donald Trump do not believe the things you think they believe in, but they have lived in a world for 20 years in which they still have to choose between whether they don't know if they can take care of their parents when they retire, they feel like they may have to take care of their children when they grow up, they're not sure if they can retire themselves, their health costs are going up, and nothing has been particularly solved for them in either the Bush administration, or I know I'm talking very specifically about American politics, or the Obama administration, and now they're just looking for some kind of radical cancer treatment, and Donald Trump was a kind of radical cancer treatment. Now, you can believe that or not, but the point of it is there is a way of understanding people who are different, who have different points of view from you, that helps you have a conversation with them in the long run. And if Roseanne is a show like that allows us to do that, I think that's a good thing, quite apart from her own particular emotional problems. I think there is a value to it. So the argument I made before about speaking to people and normalizing them works both for people you think are exactly like you and people whom you have a deep-seated belief may be fundamentally different from you. I sometimes can't understand how people can believe what they believe anymore, but eventually we're going to have to figure that out, obviously, or we're in big trouble. And that means on both sides, because both sides think they're right.
We've got time for one or two more questions. Yes, back there.
Hi, I wanted to ask you, David, you were talking about the standard and practices. I was wondering, is it actually like a real written down paper or thing, or is it something, where, well, as you said, subversive, it's changing over the time, and who's actually deciding that something is subversive or not? Is it like the screenwriters who are kind of censoring themselves? Is there like someone who's actually like writing it down? And the reason I'm asking is because I'm working for animation in France, and we've been noticing that a lot of shows, so it's for children, are getting, how can I say that? There are less and less emotions, less and less things that we can actually do compared to, for example, 30 years ago, or where we could actually have an animation show for kids that would show another kid dying, or that would show really, dramatic situations. And we all know that, to grow up and to socialize, like children more than all the other of us, like they need, to experiment all emotions and all kind of situations and fears, because that's what's actually building, their mind and their ability to socialize. So every time a show in France is produced, it's to be sold internationally. It's a big market. And so we do have Disney, for example, that's always, getting in at one point. And they do talk about standard and practices. And so we always have to lower it down again and again and again so it can actually be sold. So what do you think about this? Is it something that's written down? What can we do about it?
Like everything involved in television and some movies in the United States, it's about money. So for instance, doing a show for broadcast television, what they're worried about is a fine from the Federal Communications Commission. So for instance, when you're doing a show for a network, the rules are not written down. But what will happen is you're in this discussion with the people who work in this department, standards and practices, where they're saying to you, well, we're worried that if you're too sexually overt, or you mention drug use, or that we could be fined by the Federal Communications Commission. There's laws regarding broadcasting, and depending on what administration you're in can really determine how strict or not that the FCC is. The rules are not written down, so you're in this kind of constant battle. It does change. There was a period years ago, there was an incident on a Super Bowl halftime show where Janet Jackson showed her breast, and for years we heard from standards and practices, you can't do that in a post-Janet Jackson world. No irony. They're not saying that to be funny, and it's And
I can't live in a post-Janet Jackson world.
That there was
want to live.
And there are these forces in the United States, forces of reactionary forces that will mobilize boycotts, and the whole thing that happened with the Janet Jackson thing was there was no outrage about it when it happened, but then Rush Limbaugh, is a famous radio guy, suddenly decided that it was an issue 2 weeks later, and then it blew up, and it affected going forward what you could do on broadcast television, which is just amazing. So when it comes to kids stuff, that each corporation has their own sort of standards of, based in that same way, worrying about reactionary forces, and there really is no other word for it, being against them. So there's this thing called the Family Television Council, I think it's something, which is it's the most insidiously named organization, because its whole job is to find offensive product and say, this is terrible, don't watch this, boycott this company until they stop making this kind of thing. And it's all about money. It's all about the worry that people in churches will be organized to stop buying your product, or stop buying the products that are advertised on your show, or stop going to your movie or watching your show. So those are the things you're sort of aligned at. Now, balancing that, and again, I work for Fox, which has a very much two-sided. The story that I tell about Fox, Fox is very much interested in making money, and Family Guy has an audience, a big audience, so that they understand that this show needs to be somewhat offensive sometimes. The story I tell about how important money is to this process is, Family Guy had been on the air for like 10 years, and one of our writers got to go to an event that Rupert Murdoch was at. And he goes up to Murdoch and says, I just want to introduce myself and thank you for inviting me. I work on one of your shows and really happy to be here. And Murdoch's very charming. He says, oh my God, what show do you write for? And the writer says, Family Guy. And Murdoch says, ugh, and turns and walks away. And what that story tells is that Murdoch he hates the show, but it makes him money. And I think that's always a thing you're not really talking about, is that it's always about that. It's show business. It's not cynical thing to end on, I guess. But
We have run out of time.
oh, I used it up.
No. Everybody was great, and I want to thank you all for being here. Thank the audience, and